Hello everyone, I'm Marine Lefort, I'm a freelance publisher and you listen to Les Voix de la Photo. Les Voix de la Photo is a podcast that gives voice to professionals in the photo and image industry to reveal their journeys, their successes, sometimes their setbacks, and give us some advice along the way. Today this episode is in English because I'm in London with David Campany. Hello David.
Hi there, very good to be here.
We are at Somerset House doing the fair Photo London, and so I hope the sound will be great. But I think it's really great. We are around a picture, so it's perfect. You are a curator, writer, publisher, and educator, teaching at the University of Westminster, London, and serving as a curator at large for the International Center of Photography in New York. You did 4 editions of PI magazine, your own publishing house, and you published essays about the history of photography. You have worked with institutions such as MoMA, Tate, Whitechapel Gallery in London, Centre Pompidou, Le Bal in Paris, Photographers Gallery in London, Paris Photo London, and you have worked with publishers such as Aperture, Stendhal, Steidl, MIT Press, etc. To start your conversation, could you describe your upbringing? Did you grow up with a family or friends who share a passion for the arts? Where did you spend your formative years?
Well, thanks, Marine, for the invitation. Well, you're taking me back now, right to the beginning. No, there wasn't so much of a kind of cultural life in my family. They liked music and they liked to talk. I think the discovery of a kind of the beginnings of a sort of visual education actually came through television. British television, when I was growing up, was amazing for world cinema. We didn't have many TV channels, but they all showed great movies. So actually there's a whole generation of us who were born sort of late 60s, early 70s in Britain, who by the time they left high school, aged 18, they'd seen lots of Godard and Kurosawa and Bergman and Buñuel and Fellini and Ozu, that and Hitchcock. That was really my cultural education. That was the only window into a kind of a more interesting life. We lived by the sea.
Where exactly?
Place called Southend. So we're right by the River Thames here. That flows east out of London, and where it meets the sea, it widens out into an estuary. My parents ran a hotel there, and I think that's where I kind of fell in love with light, if you live by the water. So I got an awareness of light and an awareness of cinema. This was before the age of home video or anything like that. So films would just come and go on TV, and if you really wanted to hold on to anything to do with cinema, you'd have to buy books and magazines. So I would come up to London as a young teenager.
By yourself?
By myself, and I had an older sister. And we used to go to shops where they sold old film stills and posters. And there used to be a bookshop, second-hand bookshop called the Cinema Bookshop. And so I kind of extended my education into cinema, but that's also where I got very interested in still photography, the images from movies that were in these books.
And at this time, what was your favorite movie? Like what inspired you the most?
Very, very young, I saw a British movie, colour movie made in the 40s called Black Narcissus, made by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, with cinematography by a guy called Jack Cardiff. And they made movies together that were more artistically ambitious than anything else in Britain at the time. I can remember being very profoundly moved by that. And I saw Fellini's 8.5, which I don't think I understood. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. I just thought it was an extraordinary film. And I can remember watching that on TV and wanting the film to stop just so I could look at the image. I mean, you can stop that movie anywhere and it looks incredible. Then I got I knew I didn't want to make movies. It seemed incomprehensible to me that even a mediocre movie could get made, all those people involved. But I love the image nonetheless, and I set up a darkroom at home, and I got very interested in still photography. And eventually, there was nothing cultural in my high school education at all, so this was all on my own time. So I taught myself how to make images, got very interested in the history of photography, applied to do an undergraduate course where you did photography and movie making and quite a lot of writing, which was an unusual course, so 50% writing, 50% image making.
In London.
In London. And this was at a time where the kind of theoretical concerns were very intense. So that's where I would encounter psychoanalytic theory, semiotics, or the French disease, as they used to say, you know, the kind of Barthes, Christophe, Lacan, Althusser, Deleuze. That whole moment was very, Derrida, of course, was very big for me. I kept making images, and I was having lots of exhibitions when I first left university. And then invitations came along to write, and I had never thought of myself as a writer, but if you're invited, it makes you think about whether you could do it.
But as with, when you study photography,
yeah.
Do you know what you wanted to? You wanted to be a historian, or because I think at this time it was not as now, like the history of photography was maybe not a subject as it is now. So,
no.
Do you know what you wanted to do?
No, I knew I wanted to be involved in images somehow. And in fact, I remember reading an interview with the British artists Gilbert and George, and in the interview they are asked, what made you want to be artists? And they said, well, we didn't want to be artists. We knew we wanted to be with art. And I remember thinking, well, yeah, I want to be with images, particularly photographic images. I don't know why. I still don't really know why, but being with is enough. So that might mean making images or writing or looking at them a lot or teaching or editing and eventually that turned into curating and writing books. But being with was enough for me. The kind of pleasure of looking at still images and thinking about how they fit into the world and fit into culture. That interested me then, and it still does.
And why did you choose to be and to stay independent? Like, because when we study photography, you can be a curator in a museum, you can work for institution. You are a teacher, so you also are part of university. But
well, I always loved looking at exhibitions, and I was always fascinated with how they were made. Not in my wildest dreams did I think I could make a show. And then it's just a very strange coincidence that within the space of a few months, I received 3 different invitations to curate shows, and I'd never curated anything before. I'd given, public talks, and I was writing by then. And I think maybe there's something of the curator in the way I write and put things together.
You were a teacher as this?
Yeah, I was teaching by then. And those first 3 exhibitions, one was a solo survey show of an artist, a woman called Hannah Collins, asked me to do a big show in Spain. Then here in London, I was asked to put together a group show for an interesting space called the Jerwood Space. and Le Bal in Paris was just being set up by Diane Dufour, and she came to London to ask me if I would co-curate the inaugural show at Le Bal. She'd read a book of mine, and I took that very seriously. Out of blue sky, 3 invitations to curate shows, and it was a bit like being asked to write. I'd never thought about it until I was asked. I took it seriously. Curating is a little bit easier than writing.
Why?
Maybe it's just my approach to it. The thinking comes a lot quicker for putting together. There's a lot of practical hard work with exhibitions, but it's not... I think I make exhibitions from ground and ideas I've already thought about quite a lot in my writing. So I don't have to do all of that thinking while I'm putting the shows together somehow, I think. I've never thought about it before, but I think that's why.
Something can be interesting. It's to know about the subject. You are more like I don't know. You prefer, like, for instance, you spoke about Diane Dufour. You asked you to curate an exhibition in Paris. So she identified you as a specialized. So which subject, if you can define, because you are not just a specialist of one photographer or one specific. So can you describe, like, which subject or periods, or like...
I could try. I don't think it's subject or period. I think it might be to do with the kinds of connections, unexpected connections that I somehow make between things. I think that's why I get asked to write certain kinds of essay or work on certain kinds of shows. So that, for example, let's make it concrete. That first show at Le Bal in Paris, this is going back to 2010, was called Anonyme, Unnamed America in Photography and Film. And it had extremely well-known things in it. Jeff Wall, Louis Baltz, a video piece by Sharon Lockhart, Anthony Hernandez, who wasn't so well known then but had a long history, Chauncey Hare. But then there were also things that were made for American magazines. And we wanted to put a show together that was about the idea of the anonymous citizen, which is such a strong part of American photography and film culture, but also to kind of move between work that was made specifically for the gallery space, maybe work that was made for the gallery space and the book form at the same time, and maybe work that was just made for the page but could find its way in. So when you went in, there were 2 key works which for Diane Dufour and I were central to the beginning of the show. One was a very large tableau by Jeff Wall called Men Waiting. It's 3.5 meters wide, and it shows men waiting on a corner for work, manual work, waiting to be picked up to maybe be taken to a building site or a warehouse or something like that. So large-scale photograph made for that kind of space. And then very close to it, in a vitrine, was a spread from Fortune magazine from 1946 with a piece by Walker Evans called Labour Anonymous, a kind of serial photographs of anonymous workers. So 2 completely different depictions of the same subject made, 60 years apart, completely different contexts, but interesting to bring them together and to say that, a very expensive, photograph made in an edition of 2 is as important as something made for a popular magazine in the 1940s. And I think it's not typical, but it's definitely part of how I think about photography, that interesting work can be made in any context. It might be made by somebody very famous. It might be anonymous. Quite often in my thematic shows, there will be well-known images or images by well-known photographers next to something I bought on eBay for €4. Because I follow the image. I don't follow the names. I don't follow the market. I don't follow the canon. Just follow the image. And if you follow the image in photography, it takes you into really interesting places. Really interesting, unexpected places. And that's where the unexpected connections come from, I guess. I don't take that approach deliberately. That just comes very naturally to me, and it might take us all the way back to being very young and seeing interesting things in books and magazines and on posters, as well as in galleries. That's the nature of photography. It's found its way into all different parts of our culture, and it's interesting to think about them in relation to each other. It comes with challenges. You have to be careful when you bring 2 apparently very different things together, because you need to respect them on their own and somehow suggest a connection between them somehow. But that's part of the fun and the challenge of curating exhibitions. Slightly easier to do when I write, to bring things together on the page. But in a gallery space, things are objects as well as images, and you do have to respect them as objects.
And why do you think, for instance, Diane Dufour thought about you for this project?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, she had just curated a very interesting show with photographers from Magnum, the photo agency, around their influences from cinema. And it was called The Image to Come. And so she was presenting a body of work by each of these Magnum photographers. It might be Gilles Perez or Harry Gruyat. And then presenting the cinematic influence. And I knew about that project and I'd seen it, but also at the same time, in parallel, while she was working on that, I was writing a book called Photography and Cinema, and she read that. And Diane has very good instincts, so I just got an email out of the blue. Hi, my name's Diane Dufour. I've just read your book. It's very good. I've got a proposal to make to you for a new space I'm setting up in Paris called Le Bal. Can I meet you next week? She's like that. She's very, very decisive. So she came to London. I remember we met at a cafe at Tate. And she told me about it. And I said, sure, let's do it. Let's work on it together. I like people who reach out like that when they've... to people they don't know. I do it a lot. If I read something that I think is really good, and I've done this since really before I was a writer, I'll try and write to them. Writers don't get any feedback, ever. So I'll write and I'll say, dear Jane Smith, whatever the name is, I read this essay, I thought it was great, I thought it was beautifully written, and I've ended up partly having friends, some certain writer friends as a result of that, but also I think a lot of cultural work is quite isolated, even lonely. I don't like the fact that I have to spend so many hours alone writing, but I do. So when I'm not doing that, I try to be social. about things. It's funny writing because it's an act of communication, but you do it alone. You do it very much alone, and it's painful.
Yeah, but it's also really great because it's intense to write. You are really into something, so
Sure.
it's also something really.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say, but intense, and it's
is
really
intense.
Yeah, it's really.
It's very intense, and also, I am making my entire career sound accidental, but it kind of is, because I had never intended to write. But once writing becomes a part of your life, you do become. Most writers say this. You do become psychologically dependent on it. If for some reason a writer is not able to write for practical reasons, they get very anxious and frustrated. But for me, writing is the space where you figure out what you really think about things. So I have come to rely on writing as the kind of filter for my own thinking about things somehow. And in fact, when I was living in New York, as managing director of programs at the International Center of Photography, ICP, I was so busy. There was busy putting shows together and helping to run the place. There was no time to write. And I was getting quite anxious. And so I spoke to a therapist, and the therapist said that, very classic Freudian question, what do you want? And I said, I want to write. And it kind of came out in a very involuntary way. And I said, but I can't write because I'm doing 10-hour, 12-hour days. And she said, if you need to write, you must write. So I would get up at 5 a.m. rather than 7. And then I was fine. Mentally, psychologically, I was fine. So I do know now that I'm quite... Whatever else I do, editing books, making exhibitions, teaching, whatever else I do, I know I will always write. It will always be a part of my...
balance.
Yeah, my way of being with images now. Yeah.
So you do different projects, and can you explain the mix between all your activities? Like it's you when you teach something, you are into a subject, and after it's a book or it's an exhibition, or it can be the other way around. Like all your projects and activities, like are mixing together.
They are mixed, and they are connected. It's not very strategic, but certainly it's nice for students to have someone as a tutor who is a writer, if they're doing some writing, or if the students are making an exhibition, it's nice that their tutor makes exhibitions. So that's quite naturally connected. Someone said to me that the connection between all my work is editing. Because you can edit words, you can edit a photographic book.
What do you mean by editing?
Selecting and putting things together. When you curate an exhibition, you're editing. When you're writing, you're editing. When you're teaching, you're editing. When you're working with a photographer on their book, you're editing. And that probably is the thread that holds it all together. But I don't think I could do any one of those things on their own. At any one point, I have maybe 5 or 6 or 7 projects that I'm
at the same time.
Yeah, I have slightly too many at the moment. So there's 3 quite big shows, but there's 8 books.
Wow.
Well, it sounds wow, but it's not really. Well, maybe for some people, I've always juggled things. And I often get stuck when I'm working on something. I don't know how to go forward. So I put it down and I pick up something else.
So you need to have different projects.
And some of those books are single author books, but other of those books are collaborative. 2 of them are with other writers. 2 of them are with photographers. So that I wouldn't say they get made on their own, but when you're working on something collaboratively, it's a very different energy. You're not so self-reliant. Also, maybe because I've been doing it a few years, I know how to manage things and still keep it exciting and a little bit unpredictable. I never know exactly how anything is going to work out. If I did, I think I'd get quite bored. So I'm always trying to do kinds of projects I've never done before. And if it feels like repetition, that's a big alarm that goes off in my head. No, you've done this before. It's not going to get the best out of you, David, if you're doing this again. So I'm very aware that I shouldn't really repeat. I think it's quite natural for creative people to repeat or to circle or spiral around certain ideas or motifs. I think that's normal, but you have to be careful about it. Yeah. And
most of the times, it's you go to publisher, to galleries, museums with a project, or
very, very rarely. I would probably say between 10 and 20% of my projects, I take them to people, to institutions or publishers. I'm quite lucky that people ask. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? But people do ask. And
at the beginning, how did you start? Like, because when we start, like it's nobody finds more difficult. So
yeah, they do. If let's just think about writing. I think the very first thing I wrote was for a book about painters working from photographs. And it was edited by a woman called Naomi Salomon. And 5 or 6 years before, she saw my graduation work and reached out. I was making work with another guy called Gavin Jack, and I'd never met her. She liked it. She wrote a letter to my university, and they forwarded the letter to me. And so I met up with her, and we stayed in touch. And we were, as well as making exhibition work, we were making quite political work in public spaces. And she wrote about that for the very first issue of Frieze magazine, which nobody thought was going to be a success. Nobody thought it was going to be a success. So that was a nice connection. And yes, 5 or 6 years later, she was putting together an exhibition and a book about sort of photorealist painters. And I wrote for that. And then I started doing a master's course. And the external examiner on the master's course liked my writing. And would I write for a book of collected essays about conceptual art? I don't really like my early essays. I think they're written by a very serious young man who's trying to impress people. I think that's normal when you first start writing. And then I didn't think I'd found anything like a natural way of writing at that point, and it was painful. So I didn't do it so much. But I worked at the Institute of Contemporary Arts for money, and there was a little publishing house there, and that was run by a guy called Ian Farr, and he moved to Phaidon, a big arts publisher. And he said, we want to do a big book, like, 400-page book, art and photography in art since the 60s. Would you do it? And I'd never written a book before. I couldn't believe he was even asking. And that took me about a year, I think, on top of a teaching job. And that was a very stressful book to write. I was physically sick quite a lot trying to write it. And when I finished it, I didn't know if it was any good or not. It's still in print all these years on, sort of 20 years on, and it's in French and German and Italian and Spanish and Japanese. And
quite a success.
Yeah, out of nowhere. I know that it's written quite clearly about quite a difficult subject. The language is... I spend a long time now trying to make the writing as clear and as engaging as possible. So I don't write jargon, and I spend a lot of time making the sentences as short as I can. I think that's quite unusual in cultural writing. But I know that I have an audience beyond, the university or the academy. It's funny, there's two people who translate me into French, and they both have said to me, David, your very short sentences sound very intelligent in English, but in French they sound dumb and stupid because we don't have that. In French, cultural sentences are longer and more complex. So I said, well, just run the sentences together. Do what you need to do to make me look intelligent. It's interesting. Translation is an art in itself. So that was all quite accidental. But I could also feel that writing was becoming quite addictive, and I always needed to be working on something. But since that book, there have always been interesting invitations to write.
Can we speak about your own publishing house, PA? So you did 4 editions in 2008, 2009, 2011, and 2013. Why? And can you explain the genesis of this project?
It wasn't my publishing house. How did it come about? I met by chance someone who was head of catalogue publishing for Christie's, the auction house here in London. And Christie's has auction houses all over London, but the publishing centre, I don't know if it still is, but it used to be in London on Oxford Street, right in the centre. And I said to him, I'm often really impressed by your auction catalogues. One, because they're often quite scholarly. If you want to sell a Bonnard or something, you have to have good research on it, and it also has to be really well reproduced. So their colour reproduction was amazing. And I said, how fast do you have to get these catalogues done? And he said, well, sometimes it's just a matter of a few weeks. That's incredible. And then I met someone who was a collector, but also very interested in publishing culture, a woman called Christina Bechtler in Zurich around the same time. And there came a possibility to make a magazine that Christie's would pay for, but have nothing to do with. So they had no editorial control whatsoever. And we didn't have to have any advertising in this magazine. So, wow, what's a magazine? If it doesn't have advertising, you could do anything you like. So we thought, well, why don't we give half of the contents of the magazine to an artist to select and sequence their own pages. And then they can choose the second artist. And they can select and sequence their work, and then maybe we'll have a couple of essays and a conversation between the artists, and that would be the magazine. So it's actually the world's laziest magazine. So I think for the first one we asked Jeff Wall. I was interested in asking Jeff Wall, the Canadian photographer, because he doesn't do sequences. He makes very, very individual pictures. But would he think about a careful sequence of his pictures across maybe 30, 40 pages. And then, which he did, and then he chose a French photographer called Patrick Feigenbaum. And Patrick Feigenbaum is always sequencing his pictures, makes books. And they like each other very much, and Patrick's not so well known as Jeff. And that was a great success. And then, we did another 3 issues where we asked image makers to select and sequence their own work and then choose another artist. And then I think we did what we wanted to do in those 4 issues. Could have kept going, but we moved on to other things.
Do you think you will do a 5th edition?
No, it was a while ago now. It was maybe more than a decade ago. Yeah. I have it's not an actual list, but I know I have a kind of mental list of things I would really like to do. And once I've done them, there's like a tick in a box, and then you move on to something else. I don't want to be an editor of a magazine for my lifetime. I now know what it's like to make a certain kind of magazine. I know what it's like to make certain kinds of books or certain kinds of exhibitions. And I'm always looking for other interesting challenges. I get bored very easily, so I'd rather move on, do something else. Yeah,
can you also speak about ICP?
Yes.
You told us you lived in New York, and now you as a curator at large. What did you do in New York, and what is your job as a curator?
Well, the attraction for joining ICP 5 or 6 years ago was the fact that they were just about to move into a new space. But ICP is unusual in that it has galleries, so a curatorial program of exhibitions, very strong public programs, talks, public events, a school of photography, and a very large collection. So a certain versions of the history of photography. And ICP wanted someone with a kind of experience and also an enthusiasm for looking for connections between all of those different things. And yes, by then I'd had lots of experience as a curator, as a teacher, with collections, with public speaking and public events, publications. So I was there to pull all the different departments of ICP together a little bit more. So it just felt slightly more coherent as an institution. But I got stuck in New York during the pandemic. I couldn't fly back to London to see family and friends, so it was emotionally quite tough. So at the end of the pandemic, I came back, but I'm still attached to ICP. I have a loose relationship with them. Maybe do a show every 18 months, 2 years, something like that.
How long did you stay in New York?
2 years, 3 years, something like that. And doing a lot of shows back to back. And the last one I did was a very big William Klein retrospective. He'd not really had a big show in the US. And William died, I think, about a week before the show ended. So it really was the last show in his lifetime. But I did other really interesting shows there. I did one called Actual Size, where quite a small show, but every photograph in it was the same size as the subject matter. Most photographs make things smaller. Occasionally they make things bigger, like micrography. But a photograph that's exactly the same size as what it's of is interesting. So the largest one was a Greyhound bus, an American bus. So this is a photographic image that's like 11 meters wide. But in the same show, there was a spread from Esquire magazine, which had the hands, the fists of the boxers, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman from 1974, which I saw as a kid in a magazine. And I put my little hand against Muhammad Ali's fist. That was an incredibly strong experience of photography. Oh my God, his hand is that size. Amazing.
His hand is big?
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when you were 7 and you're putting your tiny little hand against it. So that had quite well-known artworks in it that happened to be actual size, but it also had, posters and spreads from magazines, things like that. I did a show during the pandemic, which came from a hashtag that ICP launched, where people all over the world, because ICP has a very global following, people were uploading images of what was going on in their lives, lockdown, the difficult experience of that first year of the pandemic, particularly before the vaccines. And that was a show that had something like 820 images from 820 photographers in 71 countries, just to kind of map out what was happening around the world during that first year of the pandemic. That was exciting to do. I was one of the only people going into ICP at the time. Everyone was working from home, and I would be in the gallery most of the time on my own, occasionally with a printer. And I had help from a fantastic woman who's still at ICP called Sarah Iko. And 10 or 12 of us in different departments at ICP were selecting from these uploaded images on Instagram, reaching out to the photographers, asking if we could exhibit their pictures. And it's nice to do an exhibition under emergency conditions. Some exhibitions need a lot of research and a lot of planning, and they might take 2 or 3 years. But it's photography, right? And with photography, you can make a show in 24 hours. If you really have to, you can do it. That's the really exciting thing about photography. You can't ask well, not many, but generally speaking, you can't ask a painter to do that. But it's very possible to do an interesting exhibition on almost no money. And it's also possible to do an interesting show with photography that costs a lot of money, because you might have very expensive production or shipping. But photography is like that. That's a kind of fascinating thing about it. That there's no formula. Any number of different kinds of exhibitions could be really interesting.
In New York, you continue to teach, or it was you stop all your other projects?
I don't teach so much. I go over to New York whenever I can, or when I'm installing a show, and I'll give some lectures in the school there.
You continue to go physically.
I go backwards and forwards. Yeah. It's interesting why I ended. I think there's a lot of cultural people in Britain that are attracted to New York. Well, people are attracted to New York from all over the world, because there's a lot of energy there. And people want to prove themselves that they can do it in New York, because there's no space for messing up. There's no space for... It's a hard city. So it's a very interesting question of can you prove it there? What's that Sinatra song? If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. There's a little bit of that about New York still. But also ICP is very special because it has international in its title, and it is always has been for 50 years very international in its reach. So it's not a quote unquote New York institution the way a lot of the art institutions are very in New York. ICP is not. It's always looking outwards much more than that.
From your experience viewpoint, what notable advancements have you witnessed in photography since you commenced your role as a curator and writer? Big question.
What did you say?
Advancement, like which evolution, or like, but really from your point of view, yes.
I've seen most of the changes have been very good. Most of the advancements or changes have been very, very positive. I love the fact that if a photographer is invited to make an exhibition, they are much more likely to have ideas about what that exhibition should look like. In the old days, curators used to say, give me your images and, we will put them in a show. But I think for a lot of image makers now, making exhibitions is part of the form of their work. So when I work on a show with a contemporary artist, contemporary photographer who's alive, if they're willing and they want to be involved in the form that the show takes, then it's a collaboration. I'm not a kind of curator that says it will be like this. So the last show I did at ICP had big projects by, it was actually a French-American partnership with Hermès called Immersion, where either a France-based photographer shoots a project in the US or vice versa. So Vasanta Yoganathan, who lives in Marseille, was shooting a project in New Orleans. Raymond Meeks from America was shooting a project mainly around Calais, not only, but mainly. And Gregory Halpin was shooting in Guadeloupe, former French territory somehow. But they all had really strong but slightly unformed ideas about what they wanted their installations to be of their projects. So it was just a very natural collaboration.
Do you think it's more difficult for curators?
Today?
Because of the...
That's interesting. Well, you would say that if the artists have got some ideas, then it should be easier. It depends whether you like collaboration or not. I mean, I would have been perfectly happy if they said to me, David, I've got no idea how to do this. And I would try and understand the project and try and find a form that expressed what they were doing. I tend not to, and this applies to working on books with artists as well, I tend not to just express my preferences or views. I never say, well, I would do it like this. I would say, what is it you're trying to do? Can I help you? So there's not so much ego involved. In fact, you have to kind of get over the ego and just help them make the work that they would make if they were able to make it on their own. If you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the same. I've worked with quite a lot of photographers on books of their work, and it's tempting to just say, well, I would do it like this. But in a way, I have to get past that phase, get over that phase, and then say, I mean, I have worked with some artists who don't know where to start with making a book. But that doesn't mean I'm free to just impose on the material. I have to spend a long time with the material, maybe talking to them, and I still feel I'm trying to give the form to the work that they would give if they were able to do that. So a good example is there's there's an American photographer. She's from Russia originally, called Anastasia Samoylova, and I've worked as an editor with her on, I can't remember now, 3 books, something like, 3 books. The first one, Flood Zone, I got to know the work really, really well and made an edit which I think surprised her. And then she realized that it did come from an understanding of the work. Then it became collaborative as we finished maybe the last 20% of the book. And I think she's probably now in a position where she could edit her own work. But that's me trying to understand the artist. And Jeff Mermelstein's New York street photographer, incredible image maker, handed me 2,000 pictures and said, could this be a book? And I had to really struggle to kind of try and make the book that maybe he could have made. But it's fun. It's fun to do that. And it's a process that can be very, very slow, and then suddenly it goes very, very fast. Once you feel like you understand it, it can speed up. It's the same with writing, the same with exhibitions. There's a lot of work, and then suddenly it all comes together.
So finally, what advice would you give to those aiming to pursue careers as writers and curators from your own journey? Like, what advice could you give to people who wants to be writers or curators now in 2024? It's
different in those different fields. Yeah. If you want to write, just write, whether it's going to be published or not. Just do it. It's a practice, and you get better at it the more you do it, for sure. Don't be afraid to approach people. I think a lot of writers and a lot of artists think there's a big brick wall between them on the outside and the world they want to be in on the other side. I don't think it's quite like that. But reach out to people that you admire, if you're interested in their work. They might be famous, they might be completely unknown, but what's the worst that can happen? They just ignore you. And stay interested. Don't let your interest die or suffocate. Things may not go in there's not a formal career path in culture, I don't think. So you have to be aware of possibilities when they come up somehow. If I look back now, I can say that I'm not surprised I'm doing what I'm doing. But it was not a strategy. I did not have a career plan.
Did you say yes to every project? No.
No, I say yes to maybe.
Because it's
10%.
Yeah. So you think when people start to work, do you think they need to say yes to everything, and through the time they can select more? Or do you think it's more like at the beginning we need to select the project?
I think it depends on a person, but you can ask yourself if you are someone who can say yes to everything. If I'm really not able to write about something, I'm really not able to write about something. It doesn't matter how much I like the person or how much money they're offering me. If my heart is not in it, I cannot do it. I'm not being precious. That's just a fact. I know that I can't write about things I'm not genuinely interested in. And maybe there are people that are a bit more adaptable than that. I find I'm not able to. If my heart is not in it, it just feels deathly, and it feels like I'm killing the thing I should be loving. So I have to be careful about that. But it's stay interested is the main thing. Just keep your curiosity alive.
Thank you. We will end with this
Thank you, Marine.
sentence. Thank you, David.
Great pleasure.
Thank you for your time and bye. Thank you for listening to Les Voix de la Photo. In the notes of this episode, you will find a sign-up link to receive Les Voix de la Photo newsletter. Sorry, it's in French, at least for now. Every 2 weeks, you will get a summary of the latest episode, exclusive content, my recommendation for reading, exhibitions or conferences, and sometimes even gifts. Also, to help spread the word about the podcast, I'll invite you to leave a comment and 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you want to share your thoughts, suggest people you would like to hear, or learn more, you can follow me on social media, on Instagram, LinkedIn and Facebook. See you soon!